Compiled Contact Reports on Economics Part 2. Contact Report 317.
Everyone is simply fanatical and hateful and vindictive. They do not think anything of the dignity and life of humans. Neither one nor the other is better, because all of them are sick in the head, crazy and confused, besides the fact that they are addicted to power and war, and know no responsibility for life, true love, true freedom, and effective peace. They do not want to bear any responsibility at all for the others, and so they do not want any real freedom for the others, but only slavery and servitude. Nor do they want true peace, because such a peace would mean the end of all terror and counter-terror and war. The consequences of a true peace would be extremely fatal for some countries, because they would no longer be able to produce and sell weapons of war for their own and foreign armament, from which inevitably many branches of industry would get into difficulties, and they would have to report many unemployed, in addition to the fact that many would go bankrupt and the stock exchanges and banking transactions, etc. would collapse. The warmongers would lose their posts and be deposed, imprisoned or banished, and the warmongers and Secret Service agents who were so fond of playing warriors would lose their degenerate purpose in life, perhaps to dive into the criminal world of economic criminality, etc., etc. Real peace would be a hellish catastrophe for the powerful of the world, for the secret services, the military, and for the entire world economy, as well as for mercenaries and war adventurers of all kinds. For certain states such as America, the debacle would be to stop playing world police and to stop invading foreign countries unjustifiably and criminally, destroying them with bombs and rockets, and razing them to the ground to spread death 1,000 times over. But the inhumane crimes of the war powers will continue, as you say, and everything is no longer terrorism and counterterrorism, even if the whole thing is played down and presented as an act of freedom and defense.
Contact Report 348.
Yes, the circumstances that the Pope was not murdered were not foreseen, because the events were not followed up in advance. Due to many changes in the whole world events, things appeared which were not researched and calculated by our foresighted people. It is also correct that the next Pope will be the second last before major acts of war, if the entire political and economic world situation as well as the human beings do not finally change for the better. In fact, unfortunately, there is again the possibility of a worldwide war, as a result of which the old prophecies can still be fulfilled. But at the moment, there are prospects that the prophecies will not have to be fulfilled, because there are already many human beings on the earth who are fighting against all evils.
Thank you. Then this. Are you familiar with Earth politics, the military, terrorism, and economics?
Not particularly.
Pity.
What?
Because I wanted to hear your opinion about it in the way that you would express mine.
My understanding will suffice for that.
Fine, thank you. So, in my opinion, the wrong politicians are in power all over the world, including here in Switzerland. None of us have any idea how to run a state responsibly. Either they instigate social grievances in their own country, or war and terror in foreign countries. Others betray their own country and sell it off to a comprehensive union and so on, which then results in exploitative and freedom-impairing laws and regulations, as is the case with the EU, which I believe will also be passing laws in a certain period of time, so that its evil negative, oppressive, freedom-robbing and enslaving, dictatorial machinations can no longer be publicly denounced. The politicians themselves, who pocket horrendous salaries, are so irresponsible that they unscrupulously and criminally continue to load more and more debts on the state and drive it into ruin and collapse, also in terms of debt finance. Just as with politicians, this also applies to those responsible for disability insurance, old age and survivors insurance and other insurance companies, as well as the majority of company and corporate bosses and their managers. These irresponsible persons in charge of the system are engaged in such mismanagement on such a large scale, and are emptying such enormous sums of money into their own pockets that many states, companies and corporations, etc. get into financial difficulties due to the financial exploitation, have to declare bankruptcy and even go bankrupt. This also leads to an ever-increasing unemployment, which is constantly rising. Furthermore, Everything has already degenerated to such an extent that only young and inexperienced snots, bosses and directors, public prosecutors, governing officials, judges and investigating magistrates as well as managers and other sayers are left, while the older and old are being sawed off, who have still acted thoughtfully, reasonably, and responsibly, and have fulfilled their duties honorably, and could continue to fulfill their good responsibilities for a long time to come. All over the world, the elderly, old and thoughtful in governments, offices, companies, and corporations are displaced and outcast by the inexperienced money and power-hungry young and medieval people, who are called dynamic people and who put the whole world into turmoil, misery, distress, and war, and inevitably drive the whole world into ruin and destruction. The same is true of the religions, whose bigwigs and big bosses run up financial debts by the meter and then exploit their believers again through religious taxes. Also the fact that in all Western countries the Oriental and Eastern religions as well as confused sects are increasingly and inexorably settling down and spreading, and are able to infiltrate the people with their foreign religious ideas and bring them to a change of faith, will also lead to serious conflicts in this respect. Especially Islam and Buddhism will be the main forces, whereby Islam will be very powerful and affect Christianity. This may then possibly even lead to the overthrow of the Christian religion and its sects. Beside all this, there will be Bushless, Sharonless, Arafatless, Husseinless, and consorts, as well as all kinds of other terrorist packs, like Osama bin Ladenless and other blood and murder-lusting rabble worldwide at work, which will bring thousandfold death, crime, misery, suffering, pain, and need over mankind. And when I think of Sharon and his henchmen and of the present and future governments of Israel, but also of Arafat and his fellow howlers and suicide bombers in Israel, then also of the terrorism in Iraq and Afghanistan and around the world, then everything will still end very badly. The Israelis and Palestinians, moreover, are driving their mutual massacres, murders, and other inhuman and bloodthirsty machinations to such an extent that Israel and Palestine will be razed to the ground, and the people there will actually still be wading in ankle-deep human blood, as the old prophecies say. If everything goes on like this for a long time to come, then there will also be a worldwide collapse of states and of the economy, etc. in every respect, so that the standard saying of the film, "Invaders from Mars," will be justified. What has become of our world?
We also see everything in this light.
Contact Report 398.
38. Criminal bankers. Governments and business leaders will make good on millions in pay and millions in severance pay, will engage in debt-making mismanagement, and thereby, at the beginning of the third millennium, ruin many traditional small and large banks as well as business companies and large corporations worldwide. Just as citizens will run into private bankruptcy when they can no longer control their finances because they are driven away from the tried and tested money and are given plastic money in the form of plastic cards, with which they live in great shortage of money through their pay all sorts of things on credit and get into horrendous debts, whereby special companies for the administration of plastic cards will also be created, while the banks will be out to get their customers dependent with plastic cards, which will then be called credit cards, whereby especially young people will be targeted, who will thereby accumulate immense mountains of debt, which will drive them into misery and distress. 39. The fire of mismanagement is also constantly spreading in the ineffectual governments, which also mismanage their own countries to ruin, when they incur such immense debts that they increase in such a way that the state must be declared bankrupt. 40. And it will be that before the third millennium, in 1993, a European political and economic dictatorship will be created, known as Europe Union, which will bear the evil number 666, because it will ultimately put the citizens of all the member states under total control by means of biometric data in identity cards and in the form of small data slices in the head or body in a biometric identification system, which will be monitored and controlled by a central database, which will ultimately make it possible to determine the whereabouts of each person to the nearest meter. First the USA and later the Europe Union will introduce this modern human enslavement, after which other states will follow. First of all Switzerland. And through this process the personal and civil rights of the humans will be drastically curtailed, which will be fundamentally planned during the construction of the Europe Union, whereby the citizens will ultimately be completely incapacitated and only be governed by the authorities, without them having a say in any state matters and decisions. 96. The better-off people of the affluent states sleep on bags full of money, and what they give with one hand they take away with the other, so that the person in need of help can neither live nor die, but only vegetate miserably. 101. The waters of the earth will be transformed by man more and more into foul-smelling puddles, and all life will slowly wither away, while the riches of the earth will be exhausted to the last, whereby all goods will become scarce, and the hatred of men for one another will increase, because each one wants to have what his neighbor still has. 129. It has already happened, and in the third millennium it will continue, that terrestrial man will irrevocably exterminate many animal species and their subspecies to air, land, and water, because profit is more important to him than the preservation of fauna. 135. In the third millennium, as now in 1958, countless people will be excluded from the life of society, because many will continue to live as poor, antisocial, beggars and the poor, because they will not be accepted by society, but will be outcasts or unemployed and treated as subhumans, against which no authority or government will do anything, but still exploits even the poor and beggars with all kinds of taxes and taxes, so that they cannot afford a roof over their heads and have no more civil rights, because they are outcasts of those who live in abundance, and they will be half naked because they cannot afford clothes, and if they have something to sell, it will be only their body, its organs, or the way of fornication. 151. And at that time it will be that man alone will no longer be the power of the ruler. For henceforth woman will direct the destiny of the world and of mankind as the true mother of the earth. For she will wield her scepter over man and break his lust for power, self-importance, lust for power, and lust for war, in order to end the times of ugly male barbarism, and to nip man's diabolical and murderous, as well as autocratic actions in the bud, in order to finally make peace come to earth. 158. And at that time it will be that each person will walk in step with the other, and the one will no longer harbor the other, and people will once again trust each other. They will no longer be cheated. They will no longer be robbed, and murdered. 159. And at that time it will be that men on earth will know everything about their own bodies and about the bodies of all creatures, as they will also be knowledgeable in all things of the world and of life and of the creative natural laws, whereby diseases and epidemics will be healed before they can appear, because it will be that every man will be his own, knowing and able healer as well as for his fellow man. As a whole, man will have understood that he can only exist and live in community, that one must help the other, that he must give and not only take, and that as an individual, he must see and understand himself as the guardian of the planet, of humanity, and of the human order. 160. And it will be at that time that the earth humans will have learned to give and share in honesty and love, and that stinginess is as much a means of dissatisfaction as is closeness to one's neighbor, so that no loneliness will come about. But man must first learn everything, and turn to the forces of his consciousness, and the teaching of the Spirit, and the teaching of creation and its laws, and the teaching of life. But this requires an iron fist to enforce it, so that order banishes chaos, and man finds the right path again.
Contact Report 400.
Which cannot be denied. But let me now mention other future occurrences. The next extraordinary event is a hurricane that will move towards Europe on the 9-10th of October and northwest of the island of Madeira, heading towards Portugal. Although this first hurricane since time immemorial will soon collapse again on its way to Europe, it is only the beginning of such events, because in the future it will become more common for hurricanes of this type to head towards Europe and also hit the mainland. What will continue to happen, and indeed already a long time before the hurricane event mentioned, will happen in the Amazon basin, because there a great drought has already begun, from which great and enormous sandstorms will develop and destroy the once very fertile land in such a way that it can no longer be used economically. The reason for this, as it is the case in other countries around the world, is the fault of mankind on earth, through the overexploitation and destruction of the rainforests, resulting in enormous climate changes. The consequences are droughts and sandstorms, hurricanes, tremendous storms with unusually greater and stronger lightning activity than before, violent hailstorms and hurricanes, as well as torrential rains whose water masses cause ever stronger and more extensive flooding. However, the water also penetrates deep into the earth and into layers that reach down to several kilometers. The waters act in the upper tectonosphere as an earthquake-promoting agent, thus causing light earthquakes.
Contact Report 403.
The U.S. is brazenly shouting for security and peace for humanity, but at the same time, it is doing as much as it can with basic human rights in a criminal way. Through intelligence, mercenary troops, and the military, the USA sneak or invade foreign states and spread war, revolution, murder, manslaughter, crime, destruction, fear, torture, terror, and economic terror. Beside the entire open terror of the USA, there are also secret acts of terror of all kinds in all imaginable states by the U.S. Secret Services, just as the worldwide U.S. economic crime does not know any borders and has already crept into all states of the earth. Worldwide, the companies and corporations of other countries are infiltrated and Americanized by U.S. economic managers, only to finally pass into U.S. hands. And the U.S. American-friendly company owners and corporate bosses are so stupid and dumb that they do not smell the roast, that the USA is trying to achieve world domination with all dirty means, which they are already on the way to do through the U.S. American-friendly. Playing world policeman and anti-terrorist is only one thing with which the USA is casting a spell on the stupid and dumb. U.S. America is obviously abusing human rights for political as well as economic and military purposes in a way that is recognizable to any reasonable human being, and the stupid and dumb people of the world, especially certain governments of the European, Arab, and Asian world, are watching the evil goings-on, and are primitive and stupid enough to give the U.S. the dirty hands and wag their tails to paint the floor. Slimy and hypocritical, friendship is drunk with the wicked, and the slimy ones are not intelligent enough to realize that they are also addicted to wickedness. And there are some of them who even betray their own country just to be able to make greasy shake hands with the USA or the EU.
Contact Report 405.
Basically, two types of cults can be distinguished. Firstly, a cult that is based on the course of nature, and secondly, a cult that is based on the history of salvation. The nature cult is basically the celebration of the ever-recurring cycle of nature, whereby, however, different contents are in the foreground depending on economic and cultural conditions. In prehistoric times, for example, the worship of divine nature was in the foreground, because it brought about the emergence or becoming of life, food, and death. In agricultural cultures, which has been preserved until today, a spring cult or spring festival has developed, as well as a harvest cult, and a harvest Thanksgiving cult or harvest festival. In this context, a monistic cosmic religiosity, that is to say philosophical religious doctrine of the existence of only one uniform basic principle of being and reality was later formed, in which the cult had the function to guarantee the invasion of the holy divine into the profane, that is to say unholy and not worshipping world at certain space-time points from above, from the heaven of God, that is to say the heaven of gods. Especially the cult of monotheistic or monadic religions, on the other hand, establishes the doctrine of salvation as the sole validity.
Contact Report 434.
Nanoparticles of various kinds are extremely harmful to health if they enter into the respiratory organs and thus into the lungs. In particular, this can happen via fabric and other materials that are treated with nanoparticles and that break away from the materials and float through the air, after which they are inhaled by the person. However, this inhaling of nanoparticles is in no way harmless because they are so detrimental to the health of the human organism, as this is the case, for example, with asbestos particles, which also cause life-threatening diseases. This is a fact that, unfortunately, has not yet been recognized by the earthly scientists, and which can cause serious, health-impairing consequences for many people if the facts are not recognized soon and countermeasures are taken.
That will probably still take its time, even if we distribute your warning worldwide. On the one hand, our scientists are severely narrow-minded, and on the other hand, an economic commerce has already been behind everything, such that the matter is still too difficult to stop. But many other things also are not to be stopped, as for example global warming, environmental degradation, and overpopulation, from which vast changes in nature take place. The deforestation of the rainforests and the obstruction of the country, and also the laying of concrete and the asphalting of large surfaces, contribute to the rapidly progressing climatic changes, as well as the large rainfalls resulting from it, concerning which Sim Yaseh already said in the late 1970s that Europe slowly becomes marshy.
That is, unfortunately, an irrefutable fact because the Earth humans would not listen to the warnings and still do not hear them. Other climatic changes will develop not only through the environmental pollution, but also through the resulting surface changes of the Earth and the exploitation of the Earth's resources and, like you said, also from the general deforestation of forests and the laying of concrete and the obstruction of the land, especially the green areas. And concerning the marshiness of Europe, it is to be said that the problem of the unusually large and heavy rainfalls will create new factors of climate change because through this, the temperatures will change drastically.
Contact Report 435.
The CIA also runs various dummy companies around the world, which are of a purely economic nature to the outside world, and of which even the secret services of foreign countries have no idea that they are CIA stations. But also in the USA itself such companies exist, like the former American Online, that is to say, AOL, a global company that plays an outstanding role in the Internet industry as a kind of commercial intelligence service. The company is based in Dulles, Virginia, which is a suburb of the CIA headquarters in Langley, and it is no coincidence that the company is located in this place, near the CIA headquarters. The place is named after the U.S. politician Allen Dulles, born Waterloo, New York, 7.4. 1893, died Washington, D.C., 29.1. 1969, who headed the U.S. intelligence service from Bern, Switzerland during World War II, and who was head of the CIA from 1953 to 1963. It is also interesting to know that CIA President George Tenet was a member of the board of directors of AOL from 1997 to 2004. Of course, it is denied that there are no other connections between the CIA and the worldwide operating provider. But it is an undisputed fact that the provider AOL collects secret data about its customers worldwide and even creates profiles about which customer clicks on which pages. So in this respect alone, the Internet provider AOL is an ideal partner for the CIA to spy on the Internet worldwide, apart from the manipulated hard drives etc. of laptops and computers. But it is probably no secret that the CIA has installed its carnivore program not only at AOL, but also at many other providers worldwide.
Contact Report 436.
Question. In a contact report, it says that Sim Yaseh once said that Ronald Reagan was connected with the first effects of a Third World War, but that, as it seems, did not happen.
Ronald Reagan has simply laid a foundation stone, just like the other presidents after him who have come after him. The worst of all so far is George Walker Bush, who has gone furthest in terms of a Third World War. As far as a Third World War is concerned, the whole thing is not something that just happens from one day to the next, but it is a long process that usually takes years or even decades. With regard to such a war, various presidents, dictators, and other state powers should be mentioned, who in the course of time do their part to ensure that one day, a war between two states, or even a world war, will break out as the result of all causes. And Ronald Reagan was the first to start laying the first bricks for a Third World War, which in terms of a prophecy, was announced for the year 2006, among others. But in this regard, the world political and world military as well as the world economic situation has so far changed in such a way that the prophetic factors are still being eliminated and the danger of a Third World War is banished at least for the year 2006, as Ta explained in a private conversation.
Contact Report 440.
This is something that is not only to be feared, but will become fact. I also have a reader's question about this, which I will read out here.
Question: How do you see it, Billy, with regard to aid to third world countries? Is this being handled correctly by the industrialized countries or their aid organizations? And what about arms supplies to third world countries, where the people in their own countries are killing themselves with the weapons? Per Zimmermann, Switzerland.
I answered the question as follows. Answer. Neither the governments nor the aid organizations of the industrialized countries are acting in the right way. Because the truth is that the people of the third world countries are being stuffed with food and all kinds of useless technical junk, which they have no use for. The whole of the aid organizations is built on a false humanism, which rests in false compassion and brings no benefit, but makes the humans of the third world countries dependent on aid and on the industrialized countries, instead of leading them to self-help and independence. In addition to these aid organizations, however, we must also mention the criminals who are in power, the state leaders and their vassals and supporters, as well as the criminal arms industry, which, like the powerful, is responsible for war, terror, and intrigue because it supports war and the trade in war weapons and profits financially from it, and supplies war weapons to war zones and third world countries. However, all the people in the third world countries do not need weapons, but a true and good development aid in such a way that they are taught to help themselves or to be able to work their way out of their underdevelopment and misery by their own efforts. For this, however, it is not simply necessary to provide food aid to satisfy people's hunger, but it is necessary to provide them with technical means and seeds, etc., through which they can grow and harvest their own food and build up their own industrial plants and benefit from them, if they are taught the necessary know-how about everything. All of them do not need weapons with which only war is waged and murdered, but they need effective help for the cultivation and production of their own food and for obtaining clean drinking water, as well as help for technical and other real economic construction and general progress, including the revolution of consciousness. Without these values, all development aid is useless and only like a drop on a hot stone.
A true word, but which is not respected by those responsible for the earthly states, nor by those who give false development aid and make the people of the third world countries dependent on it.
Contact Report 441.
Around 22 years have now passed since you and Quetzal told me privately that you had comprehensive cognitions in regard to terrestrial UFOs and the massacre of animals and alleged abductions which were disguised as the shoddy efforts of extraterrestrials. You said thereby that, in regard to this, involved in these machinations are governments, the military, as well as industrial businesses and powerful ones of finance, which constitute a special group, to which still smaller groups are also related. At that time, you promised that you would officially explain more about that when the time is ripe for that. Can one now speak publicly about that?
Yes, that was said. And the time is also ripe for that. With the named group, it concerns a worldwide branching from governments, the military, industrial groups, secret services, paramilitary, and powerful ones of finance, as you correctly said. Those in the know and contributors are only certain elements of the same, who profit greatly, financially, and power politically, from their secret machinations, for which reason the entire powers of the government, military and industrial as well as finance, are not involved in the situation and are also not informed in regard to this. The group is not organized. As such, rather is only a loose collection, whereby their interests, however, have a common form, which already since the 1920s was designed to operate a continuous, ingenious, large-scale disinformation campaign regarding the question of extraterrestrial life. The group, which is split into many small groups, has many kinds of technical possibilities at their disposal, which they employ for their evil and human misleading purposes. That started with technologies of electromagnetism to do with precision electronics and computer engineering, up to and including apparatuses through which brainwashing and the programming and altering of consciousness is evoked in humans. They even have back-engineered beam ships at their disposal, whereby, in certain contexts, even anti-gravity finds application. It has also occurred many times that premeditated abductions of Earth humans by extraterrestrials and the massacre of animals has been and is faked by this group. That stands partly also in connection with those illusionary and schizophrenic visions and apparent experiences of those who believe that they have had or have these kinds of real experiences. Also, wrong information and falsified pictures of alleged extraterrestrial flying devices is strategically circulated worldwide, whereby, according to our investigations, about 98% of all false pictures, films, videos, and false information is directed at moving the Earth humans to angst and terror of extraterrestrials and to engender hate and thoughts of revenge in the Earth humans. Therefore, in this way, angst, terror, and hate is stirred up against all life foreign to Earth. Especially films for cinema and television serve this purpose, as also, however, do many books which are constructed on lies and untruths, and are written partly by experts in psychology and psychiatry. All this nonsense sells very well to the Earth humans because many on the search for the effective truth trust and believe this false information, and these films and pictures. Angst, horror, terror, hate, and revenge always sell well, while the truth appears too banal, and therefore appears uninteresting as well as not worth knowing. Only the fantastic and unreal find a place in the interests of Earth humans. However, precisely that is the launching platform for the infamous machinations of the worldwide group, because through disinformation and fear-mongering in regard to the malicious foreigners to Earth, the entire group, which reaches right around the world, derives horrendous advantages of a financial, governmental power, military power, as well as an economic form. The entire war, electronics and weapons industries and so forth thereby gain an enormous boost. Yet, in the worldwide group, secret paramilitary units also exist as smaller groups which carry out the same kind of operations which, however, are mostly controlled by the worldwide group. In particular, these small groups carry out premeditated abductions which are credited ostensibly to the extraterrestrials, as well as, however, also simulated appearances of alleged extraterrestrial flying craft, which are then collectively declared to be extraterrestrial UFO appearances and are often observed, photographed, and filmed by many people. Thereby the illusion of an ostensible extraterrestrial abduction or observation of extraterrestrial flying devices is evoked. What is further to say about that is that, in this worldwide group, with all the small groups who partly also work autonomously, there exists a proper UFO trade and a subculture in regard to animal massacres and abductions and so forth. The entire thing is secretively financed through governments, the military, industrial groups, and financially powerful ones who are interested in angst, terror, and hate being stirred up to their highest forms in regard to the alleged evil extraterrestrial foreigners because they can thereby gain gigantic financial profit and advantage. It is on this basis that, in every regard, from this group, only stories, cinema and television films and observations of UFOs will be accepted and profitably exploited, which are based on everything negative and, as is becoming proverbial with the Earth humans, on the malicious and aggressive nature of the extraterrestrials. Only that which evokes angst, fear, and terror, as well as engenders hate and revenge, is accepted by the group and exploited worldwide in order to obtain enormous profit with it. Conversely, in addition to that, everything which is good and positive is vehemently slandered and is designated as a swindle, lie, and deception, as is the case with you and us, since, in keeping with the interests of the group, we are not permitted to exist, and you are not permitted to be in contact with us, rather you must be a liar and a fraud. So, from the group and their small groups, the Earth humans will be served up deliberately false and fear-influencing stories in regard to extraterrestrial UFOs and foreigners to Earth and their alleged horrifying machinations like, for example, painful examination contacts and animal massacres along with falsified encounters with alleged extraterrestrials. Along with profit, the whole matter also serves deeply based psychological propaganda in order to insult forms of life who are foreign to Earth and to brand them as malicious beings and to create angst, hate, revenge, and hysteria because great financial means will be thereby freed up which serve research for the production of innovative and futuristic weapons of all kinds. Therefore, in these Earth humans, in regard to the extraterrestrial, an enemy will be psychologically, deliberately created which does not exist, and which will, in a manner, be made into a malicious being, such that the Earth humans, in their angst, will be driven to freeing up horrendous sums in order to therewith manufacture weapons against the alleged malicious invaders. Also, with these acts, various groups play off against each other, which, however, is part of a well-thought-out plan which is carried out and implemented by secret services, psycho-terrorists, espionage groups, and treacherous disinformation agents, and which is underpinned by false information regarding UFOs and alleged extraterrestrials. Additionally, belonging to this plan is the invention of an imaginary extraterrestrial enemy, as well as a danger emerging from this, an enemy, and a danger which naturally will have to be fought. The infamy is thereby that, first of all, everything is made ridiculous because the concerned abductees, examinees, chance contactees, and UFO observers can provide no evidence for their experiences which would withstand a real examination. Then comes the second fact, which exists in the fact that angst, terror, hate, and feelings of revenge is produced in the Earth humans, whereby then the weapons industry can be built up, and indeed especially in regard to futuristic weapons, of which the normal Earth humans have no idea, and of which they do not ever dare to dream. The entirety is thereby a well-thought-out psychological network on which the progress of the entire weapons industry and the power of the military, of the federal leadership, the finance sharks, and the industry businesses as well as the secret services can be built up ever further. To this end, angst, terror, hysteria, hate, and revenge is sown in regard to all foreigners from outer space. So the Earth humans become duped and financially exploited by the responsible ones of this dangerous group and their small groups, and are deliberately driven to abhor and to hate the extraterrestrial foreigners. Corresponding cinema and television films serve as especially suitable means for that. The foreigner angst, respectively, alien angst, which is thereby produced, surpasses all normal angst, and the responsible ones of the group know that precisely, for which reason they can also thereby calculate that all necessary finances flow to them, which they require for their weapon research, their weapon manufacture, their leading of wars, and desires for power, as well as for unrealistic cinema and TV films which demonize the Earth strangers. The creation of a supposed threat from extraterrestrials, as well as the alien angst, is, for them, a profitable matter which is operated under the shabby cloak of a federal, respectively, country security, and of world peace. For the entire machinations of the group, the meanest machinations are quite good enough, which, as said, were already operating since the 1920s, and to that also belong highly developed electronic weapons systems, futuristic flying discs, Earth humans who are hypnotically and surgically converted, as well as converted in their consciousness, to robots asterisk, whereby some have an appearance like the being which is called the Little Gray. On one hand, there is the dim-witted paradox that the extraterrestrial flying devices are denied, and the Earth foreigners are made ridiculous or made out to be monsters by means of psychological propaganda, while on the other hand, A financial exploitation of the peoples results through the inciting of angst, terror, hate, and revenge, and indeed thereby in that a simulation results in regard to a supposed threat from extraterrestrials. A paradox without compare, to which the question must be put. How far are the Earth humans imbued with reason and understanding that they do not recognize this paradox? The entire prearranged game of the group and their small groups, as already said elsewhere, also includes faked encounters with alleged extraterrestrials, whereby these are truly nothing other than normal Earth humans, or those who have been transformed into aliens. In order then to affirm the improvised encounters with those foreign to Earth, psychologists and other experts are pulled in into whom the wildest stories are hammered for so long until they believe the entire swindle and nonsense and employ verifiable and genuine analyses which are recorded and published in books and documentation as well as in cinema and TV films. And since, as a rule, the supposed extraterrestrials are described as horrible villains, just according to the plan of the group and their small groups, the picture of the extraterrestrial threat is powerfully incited. Thereby, not only is the slandering in regard to the real strangers to Earth always more exaggerated, as also more and more finances flow into the cash box of those who stupidly and dim-wittedly earn as a result of the entire tissue of lies and slander, and thereby come by the means to reach their criminal goals. A certain part of the group has also fallen to a Christian sectarianism and to the supposed end times in such a way that hope is directed at a malicious invasion of extraterrestrials resulting on Earth, and thereby the prophesied Armageddon will become reality in which Jesus Christ celebrates his official return and God the Father will exercise his judgment. Their delusion is therefore bound with a biblical end of the world, which, as they believe, rests on the terrible badness of the Earth humans. And in order to accelerate this divine judgment as well as the return of Christ, they do everything in order to make the way free for that. The monstrous power of the worldwide group and their small groups as well as the religious fanaticism, together with the cultic maintaining of the secret of the entire underhanded, degenerated, and deceptive as well as criminal and felonious machinations, lead to malignant effects which could not be worse. These are the facts which I have to name in regard to your question.
Contact Report 451.
And there are many hundreds of irresponsible would-be scientists and even Nobel Prize winners on television, in journals and newspapers who can still claim that the whole thing of climate change, with all the natural disasters and their tremendously deadly and destructive effects, was completely natural, and has always been so. These loud-mouthed know-it-alls are liars and trivializers of the effective facts and certainly either megalomaniacs and completely taken in by their own nonsense claims. On the other hand, however, there are others who are paid by companies and corporations for their feeble-minded assertions in order to boost the consumption of their goods and earn millions by lying. Also feeble-minded, esotericists and other deluded, believers as well as crazy image, and profit-hungry authors and editors of mystery journals etc. of all kinds blow the same horn and make assertions that are far from any truth by fine-talking about the climate change and by denying the climate catastrophe that has begun. So there is no reference whatsoever to the fact that the main cause of the climate catastrophe is based solely on human overpopulation and all its effects.
In fact, they all spread unparalleled lies, for which they are paid by irresponsible economic corporations, etc., because they can sell their products and make horrendous profits. In the same way, however, this also happens in the opposite respect, because even through the spreading of the truth, the most diverse corporations and companies gain immense profits, especially when horrendous exaggerations are made with the truth, when shoddy practices are used and untruth is sown, whereby the truth becomes untruth again in certain parts, and people are driven into fear and terror.
Contact Report 468.
Good and evil are always connected with praise or punishment, whereby the question arises, especially in the case of punishment, how much of this is needed by man when he has done something evil, and whether the punishment helps to turn the evil in man to good. And exactly to this, it is to be said that in many cases, punishment for the wrongdoers has exactly the opposite effect, or even disadvantages, and triggers thoughts of revenge, hatred, and retaliation, instead of just a change for the good. The reason for this is that punishments only work there, and the fallible ones change to better and good behavior, if the punishments are also accepted by the fallible ones, recognized as true, and therefore also understood as a means to a good end. This fact limits the usefulness of punishment tremendously, because rules and punishments are only useful if the wrongdoers accept them and take the rules and punishments upon themselves to act justly, non-violently, and honestly. Only in this way are rules and punishments useful and bring important prerequisites for economic development, for innovation, commercial and social success, as well as for technical, medical, and knowledge and wisdom-based progress, love, peace, freedom, harmony, and conscious evolution. Through mass tourism, the stream of economic refugees from all over the world is also growing, because what tourists from the rich industrial countries show the inhabitants of the poor tourist countries, they also want to have. As a result, they flee their home countries, and as economic refugees, are increasingly seeking the luxury life in the rich countries. The problem of asylum seekers, together with the stream of environmental refugees and the stream of persecuted people, is also increasing and becomes unsolvable. It has come about, as predicted in 1951, that the end of the 1980s saw the collapse of the economic boom and the outbreak of an enormous and unprecedented level of unemployment worldwide, resulting in an increase in crime by the unemployed, drug addicts, and workaholics, as well as in crime by criminals who are not afraid to commit murder when they pursue their crimes and misdeeds. The national debts of various countries also increased immensely, as did terrorist activities. Prostitution took on unbelievable forms of socialization and was brought out into the public in such a way that even children are not spared from it today. Prostitution became an honorable profession, officially recognized by the authorities and also subject to taxation. Television became as much a part of everyday life in every family as computer technology. And both television and computers became the main information media, as well as the most important forms of public prostitution advertising.
Contact Report 469.
The petroleum producers are pumping water under the petroleum deposits in order to drive the petroleum up to the surface. In the course of time, it can happen that the water rises above the petroleum reservoir, and then, in the end, only this water is extracted. This would mean the end of the petroleum production. The whole thing would evoke a worldwide catastrophe, because the whole economy would collapse. The petroleum would get ever more expensive and just as prohibitively expensive for the private consumers as for the whole transport sector, which is dependent on petrol and diesel oil as well as kerosene. Through this, the transport of food from foreign countries would be stopped the same way as also the transport of other economic goods of every type. Also, mass tourism would collapse, and the people would have to go on holiday in their own countries, if they are then still financially able at all to do it. The cars, tractors, machinery, ships, aircraft, and motorcycles would become valueless scrap metal, and the people would have to go again on foot, or on bicycle, and on horse carts, etc. Also, many products, like all kinds of artifacts and articles made of plastic, would disappear, or get prohibitively expensive. And food itself would have to be cultivated again in the countries, which, however, would not bring much because of the overpopulation, and consequently, famine would arise everywhere. In fact, a deglobalization will occur in such a case, which is really threatening, as well as also an enormous unemployment, which in the industrialized states alone could include up to 30%, while criminality and anarchism would take on uncontrollable proportions. To cultivate their own food again themselves in their own countries for such a massive overpopulation as is given in those individual countries, which would have to become extremely active again in agriculture and horticulture, is as good as impossible, because the land resources as well as the existing farms, the market gardens, and the plantations do not suffice for it, because already too much good cultivated land has disappeared, has been obstructed, concreted over, and destroyed. A catastrophe is then unavoidable also with respect to the energy, because residential buildings and other buildings cannot be heated any longer because of the lack of petroleum, just as power stations cannot generate energy any longer if these are operated with petrol. Also, the lubricants for the motors and generators, as well as for machines of all kinds, will be lacking and will bring many things to a standstill. And an uncontrollable disaster would also arise in the hospitals with respect to medicines, as well as to the medical equipment and so forth, and as a result many people would die. That's how I see the whole thing. If other ways of energy production and other materials which can replace petroleum as substitute for the everyday life articles and other goods cannot be found immediately. However, the two materials tar and natural gas belong into the same category and are not eternally constant either. Also, the biofuels are an enormous problem which can only be solved through a definitive abolishment. And if radically effective measures for a worldwide birth control are not taken, then in fact finally the greatest disaster cannot be stopped. If all the evil really happens, then a scenario arises on the whole earth which can be well marked as the end of the world, or as the Third World Fire. Now ask yourself whether the clever heads among the researchers and the scientists, as well as the responsible ruling ones, are clever enough to find possibilities, and to take measures as quickly as possible to prevent this surely threatening catastrophe. They can only do this, however, if they finally listen to the warning, and by taking out their fingers from their mouths in order to create effective and far-reaching measures concerning a worldwide birth control, as well as clean and petroleum-independent possibilities for the production of energy, and doing things properly. It is also necessary that the people in general reflect and do the right thing in order to correct the criminal and senseless consumption of the fossil resources. Additionally, cars, ships, aircraft, motorcycles, and coaches, buses, etc. may not be used anymore for spins and holiday trips, and sports and race meetings, etc. may not be held anymore if fossil and biofuel is used. The use of vehicles with combustible engines to drive 100 or 200 meters to the next shop for shopping, or to one's place of work is criminal, is fostering the threatening disaster, and must be prohibited. Cars should be allowed only for absolutely necessary transportations and other important journeys, though a vehicle with combustible engine should be allowed to go for the shopping, and for the reaching to the job only if the way exceeds 5 kilometers. Transport of handicapped and sick persons, important goods as well as school transport of children should be considered as necessary, but only with vehicles which are serving that purpose and are specially marked. And what will be unavoidable, if everything comes true, is the fact that all problems will become still greater and more extensive in relation to the rapidly increasing overpopulation, and they may not be overcome anymore. So the demand for energy, and the need for vehicles of every kind, for accommodation and houses, for medicines, and for the basic consumer articles for daily use, will rise just as ever more rapidly as the demand for food. And exactly in relation to the latter, it is insane that enormous and irresponsible destructive exploitation is practiced by those who keep various kinds of domestic animals, which are fed with the best food that would be best meal for the human beings. This both with regard to first-class meat, which is used for dog and cat food, as well as also with regard to various grains, vegetables, fruits, poultry, and fish, and all sorts of other animals which would be best food for the human beings. So everything which is done against the evils becomes obsolete and completely worthless even before it is completed, be it through nuclear or solar energy, the power of the wind or of the water, or through the energy produced by the incineration power plants, or through medications against illnesses and epidemics, which more and more frequently and more dangerously appear as epidemics and pandemics. But also the drinking water always becomes a bigger problem through the increasing overpopulation, and ultimately becomes a rarity, while the people are fleeing or are being expelled from their native countries as gigantic streams of refugees and invade the industrialized countries, where they hope for a better life, but causing more and more refugee tragedies and catastrophes. Also, as a result, illnesses, epidemics, and parasites are spread and are carried into the host countries, as this happens also through the transport of goods and products. Consequently, new problems and catastrophes are caused for the refugees in the countries in which they had been received. Another evil develops by the fact that more and more sexual intermingling of members of different peoples take place, which in the long end leads to big problems and to new illnesses, and inevitably to a change of behavior, etc., depending on the scale of that intermingling. However, from all of this hate arises because of other mentalities, religions, and cultures, which leads to evil acts of violence which cannot be controlled anymore in a simple and peaceful way.
You are picking up things here which actually have hands and feet are making sense, as you have the habit of saying. The catastrophe mentioned by you already has begun to develop, even if the responsible ones of the terrestrial governments and the economy, etc., do not yet see the whole of it, or simply do not want to admit it, as is also the case with the scientists and the general people. And you are speaking the truth, that this global catastrophe actually is threatening and overtaking if the responsible ones of the governments and the scientists as well as the general people do not immediately undertake the necessary action in order to stop this already running process and do the right thing.
Contact Report 471E.
But all this is only the beginning, for in secret, a powerful organization of rulers and powerful people and many lackeys who belong to them is emerging from your humanity, creating a secret order of darkness with its own evil laws and orders, which are directed towards hatred against the poor and weak, as well as against the economically imprisoned and all ordinary citizens. And their desire is to seize more and more power, more and more money, and the perfect dominion over the whole earth and your humanity, thus spreading their evil dominion over the world, supported by the vassals of all kinds who are in bondage to them and greedy for blood and profit. Even the mighty of the economy feel the power and obey the evil laws of the Dark Order, which their dangerous and deadly poison of hatred spreads everywhere and into everything and against all those who are not of the same mind as the Dark Force. Thus you human beings of Earth are no longer very active, but walk in idleness and with empty eyes, and do not know what to do and where to go, because you have nothing more to do that brings you joy and good reward. And it is you human beings of the Earth, young and old, who can no longer put down roots in life, humiliated and hopelessly wandering around, without work and without home, with the result that you fight against yourselves in all things, and you hate your existence in order to finally end it yourselves, as has been the case more and more since the 20th century, and will be even more so in the future. So this time has already begun with the third millennium, in which these things have already found the beginning in a fast way, and the longer the more they develop faster and faster. So we're not exactly looking at rosy times. How U.S. President George Walker Bush ruined the U.S. as a whole in just 8 years, ruining everything possible that made up the wealth, welfare, work, and security of U.S. citizens. In the same vein, the bank bosses, bank managers, and bank board members acted in a way that unjustly enriched themselves with scrounged and unearned horrendous salaries and bonuses, and plunged the whole world unscrupulously and irresponsibly into a financial catastrophe that, as you say, is really happening. This means that more sectors of the economy are now also suffering increased damage, and are also falling into insolvency. The financial sharks have acted unscrupulously and irresponsibly, and will probably continue to do so in the same way as before, if they are not finally put a stop to their activities by effective state laws, and if they are not held accountable for their criminal actions. It is to be feared, however, that the state powers are far too lax in their actions against the greedy money sharks, because they themselves are dirty in the same way. Many company and corporate bosses and their managers also did the same for years and decades, sold their companies and corporations or ruined them financially completely, which also caused the collapse of large parts of the economy, which is probably still happening. This, however, has also led to a huge increase in unemployment, which has also increased the misery of human beings and crime. But this also means that the longer human beings think only for themselves and for their own well-being and necessities of life, the more they think for themselves and for their own well-being and necessities of life. The whole process of the financial and economic crisis, and the rising unemployment as well as the constantly increasing overpopulation, creates an ever more extreme alienation among human beings, and a mistrust of each other. Oh, by this, I mean that human beings are becoming more and more alienated from each other, and that they are showing more and more indifference, compassion, irresponsibility, and even hatred towards each other.
But this is not generally thought about, because very few Earth humans take care of these things. But it is a fact that the existence of Earth humans is in many respects dependent on their plant, animal, and creature world. The indifference and greed for profit makes many people go over the death of innumerable living beings, and even over the death of human beings when it comes to accumulating their wealth.
A great many human beings on Earth, we would say, for their profit and wealth. And all those who destroy and annihilate nature and the world of animals and creatures, they live only for their own material well-being, for their greed for possession and wealth, just as the powerful and the bank and economic managers do. The state powers suck the people dry with nonsensical and horrendous taxes and instigate bloody wars and secret service terrorist acts, while the great economic and banking managers collect millions and drive the corporations, companies, and banks into bankruptcy. And all their motto is always the same, that they only care for themselves and they don't care what happens when they disappear from the scene. They do not care about the hardship and misery, the collapse of financial markets, unemployment, and many other evils that result from their wrong, criminal, and often criminal actions. Their thinking only moves in relation to their own profit and their personal well-being, while all other human beings can die miserably next to them, although it is they who satisfy their financial greed for profit and can even eke out an existence because they are not able to defend themselves and exploit them to the point of blood. Their only thought is, after me the flood.
As usual, you call the facts by their true name.
Contact report 475.
And there you are already. The two of us arriving at the same moment. As soon as you called me, I immediately rushed away. Heartily welcome, and my greetings at your arrival, Ptah, dear friend. I am glad that you are coming today and that you are hale and hearty. Just 2.5 months have passed since your last visit. Since then, a lot has happened on our good Mother Earth, especially with regard to the predictions you made on the 16th of September. The worldwide crash of the banks, the economic difficulties, and the recession have expanded enormously, as have the economic problems and the unemployment as a result of large-scale layoffs, just as you had announced it. But let me repeat, I am extremely pleased that you are here again. Well, sometimes time hangs heavy on my hands. Have you already been back from your holidays for a long time?
Me too, I extend my greetings to you, and of course I am also happy to see you well, my dear friend. I am supposed to send you greetings from my daughters Sim Yase and Plagia, but also from Asket, Ikarina, and from all the others you know personally. But also our spiritual leadership and many others who are unknown to you send you greetings. And as for the predictions regarding the crash of the banks, you should not just talk about what I had said, because you yourself predicted the whole debacle already 50 years ago and distributed it to governments, newspapers, and radio stations. Already at that time, nobody wanted to hear the truth, something that has persisted this way to this day, which is also the reason why you are attacked again and again, which will unfortunately also be the case next January, because you have defended yourself and publicly written the truth.
Contact report 485.
1. It is fundamentally wrong to dismantle, revise, change, and renew what has been tried and tested, for only what has been tried and tested is of lasting value and leads to progress and success. This fact has been proven from time immemorial, also during the last 100 years in relation to the economy as a whole, for example in relation to mergers and their failure. Further on in the expansion of companies and production expansions, which were based on a horrendous debt-making, which drove companies and corporations to ruin and bankruptcy, respectively to the final collapse. This is because the younger generations, who as young dynamic people have taken everything into their immature hands and have fallen into the delusion that they have to drive everything into the big and oversized and have to be in the first place of the economic sector concerned. This, along with the fact that they have to take on horrendous salaries, bonuses, and severance payments in order to get rich easily and quickly. All this has led on the one hand to horrendous overexploitation, and on the other hand to the collapse of long-established and profitable companies and corporations. Through the expansion, the senseless enlargement and the increased production, which could only come about through senseless debt-making, the well-tried was destroyed. This was based on the fact that something was only renewed, expanded, enlarged, and made more rational and profitable in a company or a group if the necessary finances were saved and set aside, so that no debts had to be incurred. In addition, masses of money were spent in excess of what was effectively available, so that the finances were not allocated appropriately and true, and debts were also incurred in this respect. Wherever reason, and logic were not respected in economic and financial behavior and were violated, it has been proven from time immemorial that as a rule everything was and is broken and also continues to be broken. What happened in a disastrous way in the industrial economy in the way I have just mentioned has also been the downfall of the banking systems. This is because the greed for money, power, and grandeur was also introduced into these systems in order to promote excessive financial and banking growth. So it was not inevitable that a massive collapse would have to occur in the same way as in the industrial economy, as had already happened in the 1920/30s, and again in the first decade after the turn of the year to the 21st century. As a result of the banking and industrial economic collapse, a worldwide recession resulted then and also results today, whereby horrendous amounts of state money had to be and still have to be pumped into the banks and the industrial economy in order for them to continue to exist. A fact, however, which did not prevent various small and large banks, as well as small and large companies and corporations around the world, from ending in total ruin. And all this only because of the greed for money and power and the disregard of the well-tried basic rule that something is only bought, renewed, expanded, and made more profitable, etc., if the necessary financial means are saved and available, and are not hounded in immeasurable greed for money and wealth. This is a very bad and bank and industrial economically destructive action, which disregards everything that is tried and tested, and which is mainly carried out by the responsible company, group, and bank managers and boards of directors, and which brings everything to collapse. This criminal activity also includes the horrendous raising of capital, which is contrary to all reason and drives the capital seekers into enormous debts. This is based on the fact that loans are only ever taken out to the extent that it is possible to repay them with interest and compound interest in accordance with the income and agreements as they were received and paid before the loan was taken out. This means that loans do not have to be repaid according to possible additional income resulting from possible additional production and from additional sales respectively from possible additional profits. The illogical excessive lending by the banks to private individuals for real estate and all kinds of other things, as well as to companies and corporations, is another evil that tempts people to get into debt and is widely used. The fact that the mountains of debt and its interest rates can then no longer be reduced and paid is an inevitable consequence, and this also applies to the states themselves, whose financial management is only geared towards getting into debt. In this respect, getting into debt also means that more money is spent than earned, and consequently the states, through their incompetent financial economy, get into debt in the billions and billions with francs, euros, and dollars, etc. And this is only because the governments responsible for this cannot handle money, on the one hand, and because, on the other hand, it is not their mammon that they are squandering, but that of the tax-paying people. And just as the states act and think in this regard, so do the managers and boards of directors of banks and industrial companies. So they are all disregarding the well-tried principle that not debts are made that exceed the measure of what is permissible and wealthy, and therefore cannot be repaid.
Contact Report 490.
Please give my love to both of them. But see here, Bernadette wrote this letter to Mr. Westerwelle in Germany regarding the German language, because this man is also committed to the idea that German should be spread worldwide. The following is an article by a Dr. Senf, who wrote something about the population explosion. Shall I read it to you?
So there was knowledge spread all over the world, by the way, of the effectiveness of certain plants which, for example, processed into tea and administered to women, prevented conception for several years. De Mayo has also compiled interesting historical and ethnological material on this subject. In this way, women were able to live out their sexuality without the constant fear of unwanted pregnancy. In Europe, this knowledge had already been taboo in the Middle Ages under the influence of the Church and had been pushed underground, where it was guarded by witches and passed on to other women again and again. What interest did the Church have in finally eradicating this knowledge completely? It was both an economic and a sexual economic interest, and with the persecution and extermination of the witches, the Church killed two birds with one stone, so to speak.
The destruction of contraceptive knowledge as a means of human production.
The beginning of the systematic witch hunt does not coincide with a time when the population in Europe shrank dramatically due to climate-related famines, devastating economic crises, and the Great Plague in the middle of the 14th century. In some areas, 70% of the population had been wiped out. The average in Europe is estimated at around 50%. As a result, the number of serf farmers and the additional product they produced, the basis for the levy on the feudal lords, had also fallen dramatically, and with it the source of wealth for the nobility. In some places, this source of wealth threatened to dry up completely, and this also caused the basis of the social power and rule of the nobility to falter more and more. On the one hand, the nobility tried to reduce their loss of wealth by increasing taxes and pressure on the peasants in bondage. On the other hand, this was precisely what provoked more and more resistance on the part of the peasants, which resulted in peasant revolts. Under such devastating economic circumstances, rural women were less and less inclined to give birth to children. Now, the biggest landowner at that time was the Church, which saw its economic power dwindling more and more. Large landowners without a rural population who worked the land as serfs no longer produce wealth. So the Church superiors came up with a strategy of how they could get or force women to give birth to as many children as possible in order to produce population growth and regenerate the source of exploitation of human labor in the countryside.
Contact Report 496.
This is not the way it is done, because not only do governments run up horrendous debts, but the people are also trained to run up debts in the private sector. And what has to be said about the legitimate state taxes is that not only are they levied, but also the most diverse and impossible things are additionally taxed, such as a value-added tax, even on food. Thus there is VAT on all goods, but there is also a transport tax, a stamp duty, fuel tax, and a whole range of other additional taxes, as well as hidden taxes that take money out of the citizens' pockets. And the hammer here is that the people are not refusing to do so, but are saying yes and amen to it, even though there is constant cursing about the old and new taxes and about the whole tax system. As a result of all the taxes, many citizens get into the devil's kitchen because they have to save them on their mouths and standard of living and are driven into debt collection and bankruptcy. Many cannot pay their health insurance premiums and their interest on housing, and many others also cannot pay other important things and even taxes. In contrast to this are those who collect bonuses, respectively commissions and remunerations of many millions from banks and economic groups, and do not have to pay taxes for them, whereas the poor taxpayers cannot do anything about it, because the governments and also the shareholders allow this injustice, which incomprehensibly grants these millions to managers, boards of directors and presidents, etc. But let us leave that alone, because it is no use anyway. Because also in the relationship of the incredibly unjust forms of taxation of the states, the citizens do not allow themselves to be lectured, and do not demand justice. No, they just put their fist in their pocket or in their skirt, swear at themselves or scold at the pub table, without ever really asking for anything sensible to be put to a general vote, to be implemented and changed. And since nothing is done in this direction, there is also no attention paid to the fact that the rulers are not fulfilling their responsibilities in terms of financial management and the proper administration of taxpayers' money, and that they are forbidden to incur debts by the will of the people. But with regard to the accumulation of public debt, the following must be said. The way in which public finances are budgeted, even over-budgeted, managed and spent, is fundamentally wrong. It is through financial mismanagement that debt is created, which is an absolute irresponsibility, which is due to the fact that the governments and financial managers are absolutely incapable of managing public finances. A state must never and under no circumstances budget and spend more money than can be covered by the tax revenues and their budgeting. It must not use money in any way beyond the amount of the budget, so that it is impossible to get into debt. So if any things, and projects, etc. arise which for their handling and execution exceed the effective tax revenues, then these must be put on hold until the necessary finances can be brought together through further effective and legally appropriate revenues. Such further necessary income, however, must be of the right and in accordance with the normal taxes, and therefore may not be obtained by additional and new tax collections. But if they are, it means that taxpayers are being unlawfully exploited by government's unlawful tax collections. Basically, the tax finances must not be thrown into a uniform pot from which the most diverse things, and projects and necessities, etc. are then paid. The only correct thing is, quite simply said, that for each thing, project, and for each thing, a separate cash respectively, a separate account has to be kept, to which a certain amount of tax money is added, which under no circumstances may be exceeded, and therefore also not over-budgeted. Although this means a great deal of extra work for the tax authorities, because a state has to manage and administer hundreds of different funds, respectively accounts, the whole thing ensures that no debts are incurred, and that debts can be reduced. It also means, as already mentioned, that a project that needs to be financed can only be started or carried out when the necessary amount can be paid by the normal tax revenue from the relevant fund or account respectively.
Your words will certainly be resented by the responsible persons mentioned, and even by many of the people.